Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Galbraith, and I'm an executive member of Canadian Club Toronto. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Conservative parties across the country have experienced highs and lows lately, from losing 3 federal elections in the last 7 years while still currently holding power in 7 of the 10 provinces. Not to mention Premier Doug Ford's resounding victory last week. As this tug of war continues between the movement's centrist, populist, and right-wing elements, what does the future hold for conservatism in Canada? We're going to have an exciting conversation today. Before we hear from today's panel, I want to review a few housekeeping instructions. Please take note of the following. The click here to stream button helps if you find your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. The request help button located on the bottom right corner of the page is for technical support. I would like to thank the National Post for their partnership in bringing this conversation to you. And now to introduce today's speakers. Adrian Batra is the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun. Lisa Raitt is vice chair, Global Investment Banking, CIBC Capital Markets. Chad Rogers, entrepreneur and founding partner, Crestview Strategy. Today's discussion will be moderated by Sabrina Mado, columnist for the National Post. Another tradition that our club maintains is we make a toast to our country. If you have a beverage close by, please join me today in a toast to Canada.
Canada.
And now I'm delighted to turn things over to our moderator. Sabrina, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. We have so much to cover today, as Amanda said. There's a lot going on in the conservative movement among the provinces, nationally and internationally. So let's dive right in with some of the biggest news lately surrounding the conservative membership signups from the potential leaders. We have some really big numbers being reported, and if they're true, they could be game-changing. The Pierre Poilievre camp reports over 300,000 signups. Patrick Brown says he has about 150,000, and Jean Charest says tens of thousands with a lot of support in Quebec. What do these numbers, if they're true, mean for the upcoming conservative leadership race? Adrian? Oh, Adrian, you're muted.
Aha. The number one thing said in Zoom, I'm muted. Well, thank you for the question. And I think it's an exciting time for the federal party. When you have a number of candidates going across the country, selling their message, whatever that message is, and signing up members, that can only bode well for you through fundraising and for the next election, to get volunteers and get people interested to change the government. It's tough, and I know Lisa can speak to this a lot better than I can, but It's a bit difficult to verify all of these numbers. And so at the high watermark, they're saying around 600,000 memberships. And that in of itself is extraordinary. And, even if there's some embellishment of the numbers, that still doesn't discount the amount of people that clearly are interested in this federal race. And as the ballots come out in the coming weeks, there will be more interest. But we're reporting now, the Toronto Sun's reporting now that just in the last 2 days, Sabrina, the Tories signed up almost 100,000 people between June 1st and June 3rd, which of course was the cutoff as the 3rd. So I think it bodes well for them. But it's always going to be important to recognize what happens when that leader comes, whomever it is, and then what do they do with all those memberships?
Absolutely. Chad, numbers could mean for the leadership race and also the importance of verification.
Well, I trust former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Ian Brodie, who's running the process. Anyone who knows Dr. Brodie knows he won't brook any silliness. So there's a very competent professional group of people who've stepped up and agreed to volunteer and served the party to make sure that the process has integrity. 611,000 people, which is the conservative number we're using right now for conservative membership, remember, is the population of Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and Labrador combined. It's greater than the population of the greater city of Winnipeg. It's equivalent to the population of downtown metropolitan Vancouver. It would be the largest membership of any political party in the history of the country, times 2 plus a bit more. So it is not a number of interest or significance. It's a game changer in terms of political mobilization in Canada. So congratulations to the volunteers out there who take the time to pay 10 or 20 bucks and actually sign up and show up and do things. The apathy that we're all told is commonplace in Canadian politics and public life. Clearly not true in this instance. The people, though, who I think would care more about the 611,000 number are not any current member of the Conservative Party, but anyone involved in stewardship or running the Liberal Party of Canada, because they should be pulling their jerseys over their heads and hiding under their beds right now. It's terribly bad news for them, because the Conservative Party didn't suddenly create that membership number because of their raging successes after having recently ditched a leader. It's a sign that the country's turning towards a new choice.
So Lisa, like Chad says, is this a game changer for the Conservatives, and should the Liberals be hiding under their beds?
Yes and yes. And I mean, how can I not repeat everything that Adrian and Chad already said? But so for me, Sabrina, what really worried me, and it's a worry because I ran LEOC the last time we did this, is if it is 600,000, which could very well be, it's a mail-out ballot. By constitutional law, we have to mail out the ballot. It is actually spelled out. You can't get any way around it. And I looked up what Elections Canada did in the last general election, and they mailed out 1.2 million ballots, and they still lost 200,000 ballots. So, and the time frame was a lot different last time than it's going to be for the Conservative Party. And as well, Elections Canada is a pretty big bureaucracy compared to the back office of the Conservative Party of Canada. So I'm really glad Ian's in charge, because I agree with Chad. He is no nonsense. He understands process. He knows how to do things right. But there are certain things you can do in life, and there are certain things you cannot do in life. And I really hope that if we have that number of people who have signed up for the party, we want to make sure they have the ability to vote. And the integrity of the process is actually the most important thing for me right now. So when you say 600,000 members, first thing I think of was, oh my gosh, we really have to make sure that everybody gets their ballot and that they can return it in time.
Mm-hmm. So let's take the 600,000 number at face value. Do we think this is a flash in the pan? Are these new long-term Conservatives? Are they going to even stay engaged until the next election, which looks like it's going to be in 2025? Adrian, thoughts?
That's a great question. I actually think it's going to depend in many ways on how the process goes. There is going to, I mean, this is just me speculating, but I think it will go at least 2 to 3 ballots. It's very difficult to win on the first one, as we all know. So those that bought memberships purely because, their brother did or their mother did and just said, we're sick of the Trudeau government, we've got to make a change. you're going to have them for the long term, regardless of whoever becomes the leader. But you're also going to have many of them that just joined just to cast a ballot. Now, that's a risk that any party takes, frankly. But for the Conservatives, in order to retain those individuals, those people, and to reinvigorate sort of the interest in the party itself, it's really going to depend on what the new leader does pretty much from day one. And I think far too often Conservative parties, there's a saying, they circle the wagons and they point the guns inward, whereas the left, they go out and they beat each other up behind closed doors and then come out unified. Tories have not been good at that, and so let's see what the new leader does. This has been a very contentious leadership race. There has been a lot of daggers hurled from all camps. Who unifies, who comes together, and that alone will bode well for whomever signed up, just as purely as a member, to recognize that they, even though if they voted for X and the winner is Y, that their vote is going to count and their participation in the party is going to matter in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lisa, do you agree that unification will be key going forward? And do you think that's possible considering the race we've seen so far?
It's going to be possible because what Conservatives do is, as we prepare for a general election, we fixate on what is the real issue, which is removing the Liberal government and replacing it with a Conservative government, hopefully a majority. And caucus will pull together, as will EDAs, as will membership, and rally behind the leader. I see no reason why that wouldn't happen again, quite frankly, even though that there are elbows up in this campaign, and we haven't really seen it to this extent before. I think that Conservatives will put that aside and focus on the bigger issue, which is, do you still want to have Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister after 2025, if that's how far we make it? I also do believe, though, it is going to be tough to hang on to the 600,000 in a membership way. Party will want to do that. Leader will want to do that. But a lot of these folks are signing up for one candidate. And if their candidate doesn't win, maybe they'll drift away and we have to win their hearts and vote again in 2025. But at least we know who they are and we know where to find them. And that is an incredible part of success as well. It's not just about claiming to have members. It's you have a touch point with them. And they may regret giving us their email, but we have their email and we're going to make sure that we keep them informed. But the 600,000 is motivated by a collective, I would say, tiredness of Justin Trudeau government. And it's wanting to have a strong opposition in the next 3 years, as well as wanting to have a Conservative government in 2025 if we go that far. Just to give you a point of reference, between the 2020 leadership race and now, when we first went out for memberships, we lost about 100,000 Conservative memberships, and clearly that built right back up again.
Mm-hmm. So, Chad, a key question and line of attack so far in the leadership race is, what is a Conservative? There's been accusations that people are actually Liberals, that people are targeting the far right. How many of these signups are actual Conservative voters? What are your thoughts on that? What's the answer to that question? And does it matter for the path going forward?
Well, conservatism's a lot like that famous U.S. Supreme Court delineation on what constitutes pornography, in which the justice said, I know it when I see it. The Conservatives pay a bigger tax with mainstream opinion and even with each other because they're actually a Big Tent party. So I am a downtown Toronto homosexual conservative who also happens to be a responsible gun owner, who happens to be pro-choice, and who happens to be fixated on foreign affairs and defense policy. I do not expect more than 5% of the party to look like me or agree with me on most things. But the other parties have decided that they should have one thought only, and the leader's job should be prosecuting that everyone think the same way they do. So where is Conservative membership growth coming from? Well, if you're part of the culture of safety that are sporting and firearm owners like myself who like to sport shoot safely, you're told by the Liberal NDP government today that anyone who would deign to own a gun is a threat to society, irresponsible, and a freak. Even worse than that, if you're someone who grew up believing that Jesus Christ was your Lord and Savior, the Liberal NDP coalitions have said it is unacceptable for you to admit that in public. And if you ever ever deign to believe in any of the things that you say you have to as a member of your church about values issues like choice or euthanasia, you have to leave our party. Or if you're in our party, you have to lie about who you are. So the Conservatives have been inheriting Canadians that are shed by the other parties, be they gun owners, be they people on issues of conscience, be it end-of-life issues, reproductive rights issues, even being a rural Canadian, even standing or participating in the extractive industry and believing that oil and gas will be part of our economy for some decades to come and can't be transitioned out of immediately. The Liberal NDP coalition has said, be gone with you. The only way you can sit with us in the lunchroom is if you lie about who you are and lie about what you believe in. So there is a moment where it used to be religiosity was a predictor of Canada. It was class, geography, and religiosity. I knew as a Protestant from PEI from one side of the street, my family was going to be conservative, the Catholics across the street, or maybe their extraction was they were Indigenous Acadians. Oh, they're going to be liberals. Those rules aren't true anymore. And the Conservative Party has a massively tough job to hold together a coalition of people who have wildly different things which are uniquely important to them, but a list of things that's important to all of them, like low taxes and smaller government and a principled foreign policy. So we get to, when we stand outside the movement, poke shots and say, look at all these people fighting with each other and disagreeing with each other. And we get to, within the movement, say, you're more to the left, you're more to the right, I'm more real, I'm more tough. But which of the parties in Canada is growing in members, consistently high in polling, consistently high in riding level mobilization, right? Remember, this level of growth in the party means there's 2,000 members of the Conservative Party in every single of the 338 districts in the country. These are not the signs of ill health of a coalition. So what I would point to is remember that sometimes we like to marginalize Conservatives and say they're represented by the worst behavior we've seen from any member of their movement, and forget they're a functioning, vibrant, pluralist movement, and they've made the choice for free speech and Big Tent, where the other parties have really walked away from it.
So Adrian, what I'm hearing from Chad is that the Conservatives' big advantage going forward is being a big tent, but some might say that tent's looked like a circus tent lately. How do they keep this together and translate that tent into votes and, more importantly, actual wins?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important point because I don't know any party that's ever won by shrinking. You need to grow, right? We just saw so much of that with Premier Ford here in Ontario. And, you know, with union endorsement and winning ridings that, frankly, Conservatives never, ever thought they would ever paint blue in the province of Ontario, which is so coveted and necessary if any of the Conservatives federally want to form a majority government in the next election. You know, you need 905 and you need Ontario support. But I think that this idea of it being a bit of a circus is part of the politics of it. I mean, it's a leadership race. It's competitive. And there is a big prize at the end of that. And that's the ability to potentially sit at the prime minister's chair. And so we can sort of hear a particular narrative that there's one candidate that's so extreme on one side, another candidate is not even conservative. I never knew that you actually needed to take a purity test to decide if you're a conservative or not. And I think that sort of speaks to Chad's broader point that they are benefiting from so many other people who have a particular value system or viewpoint that don't feel comfortable in the Liberals and the NDP, which are basically the same party now anyway. So Tories have an opportunity there. And it's not just Tories federally, it's certainly provincially as well, and even at the municipal level. But the message and the narrative can't simply just be, we're going to beat the heck out of each other, and then all of a sudden we're all going to love each other and we're just going to beat Justin Trudeau. That should be the stated goal. That often, sadly, doesn't happen. But in this instance, because they just came off a leadership race in 2020, and then we just came off another federal election, which saw a Liberal minority government, this is an opportunity for the Tories to say, all right, our tent is big, it's open, the doors are swung wide open, and we need to grow. And we do need to speak to all those elements that Chad just talked about. Like, I'm a Sikh woman from Saskatchewan who lives in downtown Toronto that served in the army for 8 years. Like, I mean, I shouldn't, you'd sort of look at those demographics and say, oh, you'd be a Liberal supporter for where you came from and your family and your history and all that stuff. But there are so many people of my generation, of my community, that don't have the comfort of being in the Liberals or the NDP, but also don't feel either welcomed or really comfortable in the Conservatives either. So there is a massive opportunity. Patrick Brown, I will just say, Patrick Brown and former Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, have recognized the necessity to work and reach out to what are these so-called ethnic communities and bring them into the Conservative fold, because that's going to be the long-term longevity of the party based purely on how the demographics of the country are going to be in the next decade.
Speaking of changing demographics, there's been some polling lately that shows younger demographics, millennials, Gen Z, the 18 to 34 age group, showing strong Conservative support, being 9 points ahead of the Liberals or the NDP, which has surprised a lot of people. Lisa, how does the Conservative movement capitalize on young people being open to voting for them and message toward them when I would argue they haven't traditionally spoken to young people? Oh, Lisa?
Thank you very much, Sabrina. I think that this is a great opportunity. So my kids are 20 and 17, and you would say, of course, it's a former Conservative cabinet minister, her kids are going to be Conservative. That's not a given because I was born into a Liberal family in Cape Breton. Since we're all disclosing our origination stories, I was born into a family, a Liberal NDP Liberal family in Cape Breton, and ended up becoming a Conservative cabinet minister. So my kids, though, strong Conservative values, and their friend group as well. And the reason being is they have grown up in the past 5-6 years with Justin Trudeau as the prime minister, and they don't buy what he's selling. And they're looking around for an alternative, and they are looking at the Conservative Party of Canada because we talk about things that they care about. These guys are really worried about affordability. 82% of Canadians live in an urban center, and we're being told over and over again that you're getting priced out of urban centers. I mean, kids freak out about that. So what do my kids and their friend groups talk about? They're going to go to the States. They can buy a house in Houston. They can buy a house in Florida. That's only $200,000 compared to $1.2 million to live in the neighborhood that they grew up in. And it's not worth $1.2 million, by the way. They are looking at real live issues that impact them that Conservatives do speak to. And Pierre Poilievre speaks to this all the time, and he is engaging them on their platforms. And that's what's getting them. And I think it's a really fertile area, and the message is going to have to be about affordability, that we want you to stay here, and coming up with conservative ways to deal with this that are not only about sending checks to people.
Mm-hmm. Chad, I think Lisa hit on an important point that young people who voted for Trudeau in droves are now very disillusioned with him. How do the Conservatives move young people beyond being upset with Trudeau to becoming long-term Conservative voters?
I don't think young people voted for Justin Trudeau in droves. I think, in fact, the Conservative leader got more votes than Justin Trudeau in each of the last two federal elections. But the convenience of where those votes were counted and where they lied meant that he was able to form a government out of them. So I don't buy into the standard Democratic convention that young people don't vote Conservative. To Lisa's point, we're at a moment of rupture too, where the great progressives that stand astride these movements, not just in the Liberal NDP party, but think of Margaret Atwood, who's also a NIMBY activist who doesn't want densification on her own street, which the translation of that means she doesn't want cheaper housing that younger people could buy in her neighborhood. She wants the people who are already there to put a moat up and other people not to join in. We're at a moment where the generation that's beginning to leave the economy has taken a very, very, very big slice of the pie for themselves and put up increasing barriers towards a younger generation, saying there's no reason that you should be entitled to the same deal I got. So why is Pierre Poilievre talking about Bitcoin? Because there's a lot of young people out there who are saying the economic opportunity afforded by parents is not being afforded to me. If the market won't open up a spot for me, I will crack one open. I will demand an opportunity to create value. Now, does that mean I'm a big Bitcoin Bitcoin guy? No, I'm still a little scared of it and think it looks like tulip bulbs. But I think that there's a moment generationally why this is happening. I additionally think that the urban-rural divide in Canada, if you are someone who does not live in one of those cities, like Lisa talked about, you increasingly feel left out of a national consensus. That if you don't believe Greta Thunberg is the only authority on every issue, and you look around you and say, my community isn't governed that way, climate is a real challenge, man-made climate change is a real thing, but that's not how we're going to confront it in our community by just taxing every factory in my town or every industry in my province out of existence in my economic lifetime with no plan to transition. I think the generational rupture is about being closed off from economic opportunity and people seeing the Conservatives as a little bit more focused on that, as opposed to a handgun law that suspiciously happens after a country with a real handgun access problem south of the border, in a country in Canada where we don't really have a giant handgun. We have some gun crime problems, but is access to handguns the number one justice issue in our country today? And suspiciously, did an emergency bill have to be launched days after a tragedy in the United States? It didn't. It was opportunistic. It was opportunistic virtue signaling from a Liberal NDP coalition that said, I'm going to speak only to one group of people, which is people who ride public transit, who live downtown in cities, who are our friends, who happen to represent the greatest density of seats that let us form minority coalition governments where with less than 40% of the country, we can govern the whole country. And in turn, everyone is going to believe what we believe or else. So but it's fundamentally about the economics. So with inflation and bad headwinds on the horizon, any young person who's looking at how they're going to buy a house, how they're going to build a business, how they're going to build a career is saying, I need new choices, because there's nothing right now that looks like anything's going to structurally change enough for me to get what my parents got.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, do you agree that focusing on affordability in the economy are the way forward? And also, if they are, how does whoever's the next leader avoid falling into the trap of wedge issues where they find themselves arguing about gun control or abortion and stay focused on the economics message?
Inflation is the number one issue Canadians are facing every time they go out the door. It doesn't matter if you're going to the grocery store, if you need to get things for your kids, especially at the pumps. We're feeling it. Our American friends are feeling it. But what is our prime minister doing? Well, he's off to the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, and he's taking meetings, and he's being a hypocrite, burning fossil fuels, and doing all of those things that, maybe Canadians don't feel that he's very serious enough that he's going to be able to tackle any of this stuff, but they are. And they are dealing with it every day, every minute of every day. Canadians are deciding between their wants and their needs, and the needs are winning out because those are necessities of life for their family. So it's so critical. So that's why you hear every single person who's running for the leader of the Conservative Party bring that up first and foremost. It is the issue of affordability, and they have their various ways of what needs to happen and how it should be tackled. But it is for the foreseeable future, as we do see ongoing international crisis, supply chain issues, all of this stuff is a very real now problem. And how does the next leader manage that and tackle that and handle that? Well, it's going to depend on who he or she puts around them in terms of, a leadership committee and their shadow cabinet posts, and all those things matter. But how do you get that translated from winning a leadership to then winning an election? Well, I think the narrative is really entrenched, and you really hear only Conservatives talking about things like Lisa just mentioned and Chad just talked about: the housing, the affordability, the hypocrisy of those that are on the left that, you would say, oh, they're, hardcore environmentalists, but don't develop on my street, for example. Can
I jump in there with an example just to beef up, to boost and amplify Adrian's point? Let's remember, Pierre Poilievre said, I'd like to have a debate about fiscal policy. And I would like to challenge the current governor of the Bank of Canada in the position he's taking to accelerate inflation as opposed to fight inflation, because I view the role of the governor to be fighting inflation. And the response from political opponents and people in the Liberal NDP government was to say, not that Pierre Poilievre had a different view and they disagreed with it. The response was to say, you are not allowed to have that opinion. You cannot criticize the governor of the Bank of Canada because that person is the governor of the Bank of Canada. And let's remember, the jerk that is the governor of the Bank of Canada opposed a daycare for 80 kids on his own street in Cabbagetown because he was worried the traffic would bother him and it would disrupt the historic nature of his neighborhood. So when these effete elitists say in Canada, not only do we have a view and this is how we're going to govern, but you are not allowed to challenge us, because if you do, you are outside the mainstream consensus, and those are opinions that are verboten. That was the response to Pierre Poilievre trying to debate money supply in this country during this leadership. And it's not just Pierre alone, lots of leadership candidates, but it's not an unreasonable position to say the job of the governor of the Bank of Canada should be about talking about fighting inflation. And there's an example about how it comes back to one elite urban consensus that has to exist on its own in a vacuum, and no other view in the view of some folks is allowed to exist. Sorry, Adrian, I couldn't jump in without picking on TIFF and trying to stop a daycare on the street.
I think that is such a good point, because it's so indicative of that other part of this narrative of, these so-called elites versus Main Street, right? And I know a lot of Conservatives use that. Certainly, the former Conservative mayor that I worked for used that narrative to great success. But I think it's so pronounced now. Like, talk radio hosts and certain people in the media can dismiss this discussion about the Bank of Canada just as that. Oh, it's so silly and it's so ridiculous. They can dismiss it, but a vast majority of Canadians are not dismissing it, Sabrina. And I think it's so critical that, again, whomever becomes the leader in the next few months recognizes that they'll have a narrative they have to push back against in order to continue to speak for more Canadians, the individual Canadians, the ones who are going to go out and vote, the ones who are going to go out and support you, and the ones who have been abandoned by the Liberals and the NDP.
So I'm going to build on Adrian and Chad on that one. So I was listening to talk radio this morning, and I heard a panel, and on the panel they were discussing the new gun legislation. And I heard one of the panelists continuously say, we don't need to have handguns in this country. We need to have better this. We need to have better that. And I just thought to myself, if you're a gun owner in this country, a law-abiding gun owner, what you're hearing is, you're not allowed to have a gun in this country. Mm-hmm. You're not allowed to do this. You're not part of society. You're not a good person. And that's why you end up having these kinds of movements that grow up very quickly as a result of the perceived majority dictating how folks are going to live. And that is a real problem. And I think that's what the young people get their back up on. Don't tell me how to live. Don't tell me what to do. So it is like that backlash from young people by being told what they can and can't do. And they don't necessarily buy in to what the narrative that has been set by Ottawa or by the Liberal Party. The last thing that I would add is Tim Hudak, I thought really, he says it a lot, and I agree with him. He said COVID was a point in time where people became comfortable with restricting other people's freedoms, telling other people what they can and can't do, and they think that it's acceptable. And the people who are being restricted are the ones that are going to say, wait a second, that's not how it works. And maybe that's why we have 600,000 people who are signed up to be voting in the Conservative leadership.
So I have an audience question here, and I encourage everyone watching to send in questions so I can ask them of our panelists. Lisa, you had mentioned before about it not just being about the leader, but who they end up surrounding themselves with and putting into the shadow cabinet. So our question here is, do you feel the Conservative leadership and advisors have the smarts to develop a plan and execute to win the next election? The past people have been a disaster. Lisa, what do you think?
The past people are my friends. I can't accept that. What I would say is, of course, absolutely. I mean, take a look at what Chad Rogers just did. Chad Rogers took something that had a narrative spun around it that Conservatives were crazy and they were calling for the firing of the governor of the Bank of Canada, and how dare they, and they shouldn't do it. And he just explained it very clearly, which is, we want to talk about fiscal policy. We want you to be held accountable, and we want to make sure that we understand, or you understand, that we disagree with how things went. And it gets torqued into this one line. And if people like Chad are around the new leader, maybe there are, maybe they're not. There's lots of people in this Conservative Party who can be very innovative area. They're smart people, guys. I mean, yes, the answer is yes. Yes, of course, we're going to have people who are going to be able to do it. I mean, I'm going around in circles here because I just can't accept the premise that we're a clown show. We're not. We have really good people who are going to be able to bring the next leader to the Prime Minister's office. I truly believe that.
There's also, to Lisa's point, a standard trope that says anyone who has a position in reaction is a dummy and is a retrograde seeking to protect the past. So I don't want to go with the classic William F. Buckley definition of conservatism as standing athwart history yelling stop. I don't think that's been the trajectory of Canadian conservatism. But it is a matter of saying, because Donald Trump existed south of the border, and notionally that has a relationship to Canadian conservatism, everything you disagree with in conservatism, you can marginalize by saying it is the domain of mouth breathers. So that could the Conservative Party ever possibly be smart enough to govern? Well, I may not vote for Justin Trudeau, but I think he's a pretty clever guy. And I think he's not a prime minister I agree with on much, but I think he's pretty good at being prime minister. Guess what? Does his CV reveal that he had the incredible depth or the smarts to do this job? It most definitely does not. Do I think he was able to surround himself with smart people? Some exceptionally smart people, and some dum-dums. That is the truth of who ends up being willing to make themselves available to go into the huge indignity that is public service. Ask Lisa about her worst days when she was defined by one mistake, a public servant 10 levels down from her maid that she had to stand up and defend, and how much fun that was. So I think we've got to be careful of the reductionist definition that parties are homogeneous, that they represent one defining culture. They are defined by the people who show up, do the exceptionally hard work, and dedicate their lives to it a year at a time.
Yeah.
Adrian, Chad touched on something I think is really interesting, and it's how the Canadian Conservative movement is sometimes defined by what's happening in the U.S. People think they're all the same, even though there are quite large differences. How does the Canadian Conservative Party differentiate itself and, if necessary, separate itself from some of what we're seeing on the more radical edges of the GOP?
Well, my co-panelists have both sort of touched on that to a degree. You know, Lisa talked about how when you keep telling people, no, you can't do this, you can't have that, you see these sort of fringe elements of both sides of the political aisle, left and right, sort of emerging. And the media likes nothing better than a crazy narrative and giving them airtime. Whereas I think for the vast majority of anybody that would even consider, they may not, overtly say I'm a Tory, and it takes a particular hardcore partisan to be going to the conventions when we used to have them, or really supporting and going out and volunteering. You have to have a really strong dedication to want to do that. But where majority of Canadians sit is a very comfortable spot, I think, for Canadian Conservatives. I don't think that that's the same as Republicans. It has been said that if Hillary Clinton lived in Canada, she'd be a conservative, because she's more of a red Democrat. They're more fiscal conservative, or whatever the case may be. Maybe that was pre, Bill Clinton, President Hillary Clinton. I don't know. She changed her stripes pretty quickly. But the notion that that conservatives here and Republicans down there should be the exact same is, I think it's a bit of a lazy narrative, and it's an unfair one for conservatives in Canada. I think that there are similarities. Certainly, there's a pushback against this sort of woke culture, this virtue signaling. That's a consistency again for both sides of the border, but policy-wise, you find that Republicans are far more apt to be hardlined and way, way, way more partisan. Whereas I think in Canada, it's Liberals that you will find far more partisan and unwilling to find compromise, where Conservatives here are willing to do that. So that's probably a better success story for us here north of the border, Sabrina, and something that Tories should talk about more. But they're far too often just simply defined. And this is what Chad just touched on with the tragedy that happened in Uvalde and Buffalo, where suddenly narratives that the Liberals and NDPs can capitalize here in Canada, therefore putting Pierre Poilievre, Jean Charest, Patrick Brown, and others in this awkward position where Tories are often talking about social issues instead of the economic ones, where we're put on the social issues, Tories tend to lose.
We also need to remember some simple history. The Republican Party is against institutions. It's an anti-monarchist institution. It was also anti-slavery in its great moments of virtue. The Republican Party is a reactionary movement that seeks to contain and challenge the power of its national institutions. Canada's political tradition comes from the UK, where the Conservative Party was not at all a reaction. The Conservative Party was the domain of the institutions. It was the builder and protector of institutions. Now, Canada had a break in the 60s and 70s in a big political way. One, with the demise and the takedown of Diefenbaker by Dalton Camp et al., there was a moment of the birth of party democracy. So we stopped doing what the UK and Australia did, which is only letting the elected members of caucus choose who the leader is. We ended up having a broader and broader franchise of democracy. The Conservatives were the first to do in Canada. It's now commonplace in all political parties. The second was post-Meach. There was this big break where parties became ideological coalitions, not just class-based and religious ones. So there was a space for lots of people who believed in individual things passionately and a lot of other things collectively, choosing to sit together. There you see some of the difference we've touched on today, but not addressed, where there's a conservative movement, which is not necessarily a partisan thing, and a conservative party. And the two are usually in league, but they're not always the same thing. The danger is when you take the worst actor from any group and define the whole group on that basis. I do not believe that all New Democrats are anti-Semites, despite the fact that the New Democratic Party continues to put forward in every election at least one seriously anti-Semitic or problematic candidate. I do not believe all liberals secretly like to go to parties in blackface, despite the fact that their leader has done so on repeated occasions, and I don't accuse them of that. But the Conservative Party has not extended the same privilege. The worst behavior of any Conservative Party member or purported Conservative Party member is then the domain of what we're allowed to accuse the entire party.
Mm-hmm. I want to take our discussion beyond just the Conservative Party of Canada, because we've seen several new parties pop up on the right, both on the provincial scale and national. In Ontario, we saw New Blue. Nationally, obviously, we have the PPC. Lisa, what are your thoughts on how these parties, or will they influence the Conservative movement? And do you think they're here to stay?
I don't think they're here to stay, but I think they're absolutely a natural reaction to the big tent not being as big as people think it should be, or it is, or it doesn't include them. So they decided to move outside the Big Ten. And I just go back to the fact it comes down to leadership, and it comes down to the leader to make that decision to bring everybody back in and everybody together. And we have been successful at doing that as a conservative movement, conservative party, in a number of times. And I think we'll continue to do that. So no, I'm not as concerned. And the other thing I would say is starting a new party is really difficult. It is not for the faint of heart. It takes years and years and years, and you know that from Maxime Bernier. And we'll see what happens to the PPC in the next election, whether or not those voters now see some of themselves in the Conservative leadership that we will have in September. And if they do, the PPC will be an afterthought, and people will come back to the Conservative movement.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Sabrina, if I could. Parties like the PPC had sort of one message for their supporters, and that is gone for the most part. So it would presume that they would either go back and into the sort of blue fold, as it were. But we saw it in Ontario here with New Blue that you just mentioned. They were irrelevant, insignificant. They didn't elect a single MPP, But Conservatives shouldn't take advantage of that either. The success of the Reform Party in all those decades ago was because so many who felt abandoned by their own party, and all the years that ensued after that with Peter MacKay and Stephen Harper and all the parties coming together and all of the Canadian Alliance and all of these things, Conservatives united win. They know that. And so I don't know, anecdotally, you can hear that because of the PPC vote in certain ridings that went over, the Tory didn't win. I don't think we will see that in the next federal election, or even a provincial election for that matter, just because that message that those fringe groups, those fringe parties had, those grievances are ostensibly gone.
I also have never heard a New Democratic candidate have to defend the continued existence of the Marxist-Leninist Party, which is registered provincially.
Exactly.
So there are some individuals who use activism, standing as a party, as a means of speech. It's not really a means of pursuing office. The Animal Rights Party is a registered party. I think they're I don't know that they were expecting to elect a seat. I think they were trying to use this as an exercise in advocacy. And as a conservative, I don't take ownership of parties other than the one that I choose to vote for.
I have another related audience question here. What will the new leader need to do to bring the tent together? It seems daunting with all the buried interests. Can they bring consensus after a divisive fight? Lisa, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, good candidates. Finding really good candidates across the country that people identify with, that see as being in a government, seeing as being cabinet ministers. I think that is a real key to showing that you're a government in waiting. And if you look like it and you act like it, then people are going to stick around to be part of it. And I think that, to me, would be something that a leader should consider.
Mm-hmm. Chad, how does the party build out a slate of good candidates beyond just whoever the next leader is?
It's extremely hard work. You have to do what a couple of friends of mine did, which is insert yourself, lie about why you're going to meet with a talented female executive who's running one of the most important transportation pieces of infrastructure in the entire country, lie about why you're trying to get on her schedule, sneak your way into her office, and then begin to explain to her that if the country's going to be stronger, people like her have to resign their posh, amazing appointment running a piece of critical infrastructure at a moment of huge growth, give up everything and take on the indignity of risking running, winning a nomination, winning in a government, then potentially standing for cabinet. You can't build great cabinets without great lumber. The great lumber is talented human beings who are willing to spend their lives and time with their families to step up and serve. And it's extremely hard work. So to the next leader, I would only say you can't under-resource it. It needs to have a lot of people and a lot of dollars and a lot of time, because it doesn't just pop up. Think of the excitement in 2015 with all the excellent work that Katie Telford did in recruiting truly a long list of star candidates to populate the first Liberal cabinet. Now, then you don't listen to them, ignore them, and let most of them leave because they're not being used. But we don't talk about that. I would just say the other part is know that your job as leader, once you're elected, is not to perform as the world's best leader of the opposition. It is your job to teach people that you're ready for the job of prime minister. So that means leading a team of senior people as well, and auditioning every day for the big job you want, not the job you have.
Yeah. Adrian, I want to touch on something else that will be important for the next campaign, is the Conservatives' relationship with media. Often it's painted as being adversarial. What are your thoughts on that, and how can the conservatives create a better relationship with media and use it to their benefit?
So I'm going to answer this in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to put on my old hat as a part of, hardcore political staffer. We ran a campaign that it was very effective to have the media as our foil. The public, as much as it frustrates you and me, Sabrina, being journalists, the public has a suspicion of media, and it wasn't created by Donald Trump. It's always been there. There's a distrust, a mistrust. There's all sorts of things. So there have been very successful political campaigns that have been run and won on making the media your foil. The long-term challenge with that is that it's the old saying, don't pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel, because they'll just keep coming after you. They'll just keep coming after you, and then they will define who you are before you even have a chance to define yourself. So conservatives often fall into that trap. It's just a media story, or they don't cover the Liberals the way they cover us. That may be true to a degree, but there are plenty in this modern day of either campaigning and governing with all advents of different types of platforms. There's an ability to communicate your message that goes above the heads of the so-called mainstream media. So you don't have to fall into those pitfalls that perhaps maybe the CBC may be laying there for you. And it's also about the media itself. They missed many, many, many big stories, which has, I think, lent to the distrust by the public in general on both. And I'm talking about Canada and the US. So there's no value in the ongoing narrative for conservatives to say, oh, it's just the big bad media. I just don't find it necessary, because the public has their own opinion on that already. But recognizing that there are certainly other ways to communicate your message that goes beyond, sadly, goes beyond us.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, in your experience, how was it being a conservative dealing with the media? And are there ways that relationship can be improved?
There's always ways to improve, for sure. No matter how well you get along on a personal basis, no matter how nice you are. I mean, I'm from Cape Breton. I try to be nice to everybody. That still doesn't necessarily help you in terms of getting fair coverage. And I fundamentally don't believe that conservatives get fair coverage. I think Chad is exactly correct. I mean, he made a point of talking about, Katie Telford recruited some great people, and 3 of them left cabinet extremely angry and vocal. And I think that's a lot. That's something that should be discussed and should be talked about in a more comprehensive way than what is currently being covered. And certainly, we like to say it this way, but if that happened to Stephen Harper, imagine what that would have been like. It would have been cataclysmic. It would have been something significant. So that all being said, you still have to be respectful. You still have to acknowledge questions. But I got to tell you, I'm at the point in my life now that I can recognize when a question is coming at me from a very aggressive tone and a very, I would say, baiting tone. And I think some reporters like to bait conservatives and like to get that angry comment, and that serves to be a great form of clickbait to get people to come in on the article. And it's disappointing, but it is a reality, and you see it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Sabrina, I just add, I'm a paid subscriber to all the major newspapers in the country. I'm a big believer in media. I'm an investor in new digital media properties because I believe in their capacity for growth. But here's what, if I were still working on political campaigns, and I haven't for more than a decade and I won't ever again, here's what I would know as a consultant. I don't care anymore. I care about putting their face on TV, which I can do with ads 80% of the time. I care about teaching people their names. I care about high-touch emotional outlets like radio, and I care about digital. But when my own tweets as a party leader have greater reach than any media outlet other than the evening newscasts on the networks, what the hell do I care about the opinion commentariat? When's the last time an editorial endorsement from a masthead in this country elected a member in that riding or nationally? So I would say reporting and media, super important. Driving the political dialogue, voters are not looking to media. Voters are looking to media outlets for great investigative, great accountability stories, great consumer reporting, great financial and business reporting. There's not a single voter who's waiting to open up the newspaper or listen to an op-ed or a pundit on TV tell them how to vote. That's just not what the voter is tasking the media with anymore. It's when the revolution finally happened and they stormed the Bastille, they discovered there were only 9 people left in it. I think the media's constant state of anxiety attack and hyperventilation about whether or not they're still relevant, they can put the paper bag down and know that politically they're just not even on the field playing anymore.
Adrian, I don't want to start a fight here, but what do you think about what Chad just said?
Well, I mean, how can you argue when Chad lays it out so honestly? I mean, there's an honesty to that. But that is part of the media's challenge, right? I mean, you saw so many post-election conversations with, very important names from big networks in the United States after President Trump was elected. What did we get wrong? How did we miss this? Well, no, you didn't miss it. You did miss it, but it was already there. You just chose to look the other way, or it didn't fit your box. I think that, I long accepted that the editorial endorsements of the Toronto Sun, which have consistently been conservative since its founding in 1971, may have had an impact 30 years ago, but they don't have the impact that they do now. And I can acknowledge that without having to, breathe into a paper bag. I'm acutely aware of that.
I don't want to get you in trouble. I don't want anyone to get pulled into a management meeting.
I appreciate though that there still are people who support us directly, so that's important. But yeah, I mean, many in the media they need to acknowledge that they have their own bias. Their editorial bias is such that it is. It's those that are pretending to be, neutral and down the middle that get themselves into trouble. People know who you are. Lean into it and just accept it for what it is. It's just pretending is not good. But they're all to Lisa's point. There always is an ability to improve that relationship. But knowing that a reporter has an editor or a producer or someone above them that is going in there with a story in mind, and it's going to take a lot to change that perspective. That doesn't mean you shouldn't still acknowledge and do that work. But Sabrina, we just don't have that rigor and that impact as we used to, because so many people get their news and information from so many other ways, and it's not via us anymore.
But I remember I carved out a specific exception for accountability. If you discover someone in public office is corrupt, is not worthy of the office, is doing things they shouldn't do, that destroys careers, and that's a meaningful role for media. Their influence, the public listens to it every time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, we are very close to being out of time. So let's do a final quick lightning round. Answers under 30 seconds. What is the most important issue facing the Conservative movement in Canada going forward? Lisa, what do you think?
Winning the next election. I think the Conservatives have to win the next election. I think that should be that is the main focus.
Adrian?
Remembering where the political enemy is, and it's not around that. It's not around your own table, and it's recognizing that the Liberal NDP coalition government in this country is setting us down a very bad path, and the focus on electoral success is key.
Chad?
Constructing a plan that lifts Canada out of the total irrelevance, being the bottom of the pack of mediocre middle powers, with an aggressive economic and foreign policy that says we're different and we're willing to jump ahead, and not continuing with this fantasy that we're still important or relevant to anyone outside of our own borders. Where the bathwater cocktails have to stop.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Lisa, Adrian, Chad. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up and throw it back to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Adrian, Lisa, and Chad, for taking the time to join us today. As a Conservative myself, I enjoyed the conversation. I particularly enjoyed the thoughtful depth of the conversation. I think a lot of the time, the future of conservatism is either, you're black or you're white. And I think there's lots of shades of gray to the party. It's a big tent, and I think it's critical for our democracy. Bathwater cocktails aside, which I will not be taking in, Chad. That metaphor is going to stick, I'll tell you that. Sabrina, thank you so much for your guidance and your contribution to today's conversation. You were wonderful. Thank you to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeeting.ca, for making it possible for us to join and gather today virtually, and to the National Post for their partnership. Check your inboxes for our follow-up email this afternoon with links to the video from today, our survey, and a special discount offer from the National Post. Guests, we hope you'll join us for some upcoming events as we wrap up our season. On the evening of June 22nd, join us as we host our annual Pride celebration. Katie Dutschak from RBC, Andrew Kriegler from IROC will sit down to discuss how business, politics, and civil society can prioritize 2S LGBTQ acceptance for the mainstream queer rights movement and why it matters. And on June 23rd, we host our final event of the season. John Graham of CPP Investments will join us to discuss and hear an update on how the $539 billion fund is navigating rising inflation, market volatility, and a changing climate. To learn more about our upcoming events, explore our website at canadianclub.org, browse our rich archives of past events, and check out our new updated membership categories with enhanced benefits at a variety of levels. Please consider becoming a member to support our club's work. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay healthy and safe.